"Don't drink that, your grace," the maid whispered, so close to his ear that her breath stirred the fine hairs at his temple, and her small work-roughened hand closed over the stem of the goblet before it could reach his lips. For a heartbeat the Duke of Aberbrove did not move. The great dining hall of the Aberbrove estate glittered around him, all candle flame and silver, and the low murmur of guests who had not yet noticed that a scullery girl in a plain grey gown had laid her fingers upon their host's wine. Errol felt the warmth of her hand against his own, felt the tremble in it, and he saw close and clear the terror in her eyes, not the terror of a servant caught in some blunder, but the far older terror of a person who has seen death coming and has thrown herself in its path. "Take your hand from my glass," he said quietly, and did not. "Please," she breathed, her lips barely moved. "There's monkshood in it. I saw it poured. If you drink, you will be dead before the sweet is served." The word landed in him like a stone dropped into a still pond. Monkshood. He knew the word the way a soldier knows the sound of a musket being cocked in the dark, knew it and felt the whole ordered world of the dinner tilt very slightly, as though the floor of Aberbrove had shifted beneath its ancient stones. Around him the candles still burned. His cousin Lionel still laughed at some jest 3 seats down. The steward, Mr. Krell, still stood against the panelled wall with his hands folded and his long face composed. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Errol set the goblet down. He did it slowly, without spilling a drop, the way a man sets down a thing he intends to come back to. The maid drew her hand away and stepped back into the shadow behind his chair, and he could hear her breathing, quick and shallow, like a bird held too tightly. "You are unwell, Errol?" That was Lionel, leaning forward, his handsome face arranged into a mask of cousinly concern. "You have gone quite pale. Shall we call for the physician?" "I am perfectly well," the Duke said. His voice, which had frightened grown men across battlefields and council tables alike, was smooth as the tablecloth. "The wine has an odd colour to it tonight. Krell, I think this bottle has turned. Have it removed and bring another from the cellar, a bottle I shall choose myself." He watched the steward's face as he said it. Ambrose Krell had served the House of Aberbrove for 11 years, a lean grey man with a voice like a closing door, and in that moment Errol saw something flicker behind his eyes, there and gone, a shadow passing over deep water. Then Krell bowed, exactly as he always bowed, and said, "Of course, your grace," and came forward to take the goblet away. "Leave it," Errol said. The steward's hand stopped in the air. "I find I have a curiosity about turned wine," the Duke went on, and now he smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. "Leave the glass where it stands. No one is to touch it." No one. His gaze moved down the long table over the powdered and the perfumed, the country gentry and the 2 visiting merchants and the widow, Lady Sibylla Cray, with her cold bright eyes, and last of all over his cousin Lionel, who was still smiling. "We shall let it breathe." The talk resumed, uncertain at first, and then, because these were people trained from birth to pretend that nothing was ever wrong, easily. Someone called for the fish. A footman refilled the ladies' glasses. The great chandelier turned very slightly on its chain, scattering its crystal light across the ceiling, and the dinner at Aberbrove went on as though a young woman had not, a minute before, stopped murder with the palm of her hand. But the Duke did not touch his food. He sat with the poisoned goblet at his right hand like a dark jewel, and he thought. He had been a hard man for a long time. He knew it and did not much regret it. 10 years a widower, master of one of the oldest names in the county, he had buried a wife he had married for duty, and had learned to trust and had lost to a fever in a single terrible autumn, and after that he had let the softness go out of him, because it had proved a liability. Men called him the Cold Duke, the Iron Duke of Aberbrove, and worse things behind their hands. He let them. A cold man is a difficult man to injure. He had built his life on that principle as another man builds a house on rock. And yet here was a girl, a nothing, a shadow from below stairs, a creature he could not have named an hour ago, who had risked everything she had, which was her place and likely her life, to keep him breathing. It made no sense to him. It sat in his chest like a coal. When at last the ladies withdrew and the port went round and Errol had endured as much of his cousin's conversation as a man could endure, he avoided the fatigue of a landlord's cares and left the hall. He carried the poisoned goblet himself, cupped in a linen napkin, and no one dared remark upon it. He found her in the passage outside the still room, where he had sent word for her to wait. She stood very straight against the whitewashed wall with her hands folded over her apron, and when she saw him her chin came up though her face was the colour of ash. She was younger than he had thought, 3 or 4 and 20 perhaps, with a plain honest face, fair skin gone pale with fright, and a quantity of brown hair pinned up under a linen cap with a few strands escaped about her temples. Not a beauty. Not the sort of face a man carried into battle in a locket, and yet there was something in the steadiness of her look, in the way she did not drop her eyes even now, that arrested him more surely than any beauty could have done. "What is your name?" he asked. "Winifred, your grace." Her voice was low and even, though he could see the pulse going hard in her throat. "Winifred Prowse. I am under cook, or I was. In the scullery, mostly. I fetch and I scrub and I carry the dishes up when they are short of hands, which they were tonight on account of the great dinner. Winifred Prowse." He turned the name over. "And you say there is monkshood in this glass." "I do not say it, your grace. I know it." She swallowed. May I show you why I know it, or you will think me a mad woman or worse." He inclined his head. She came forward, and he watched her master her own fear by inches, the way he had once watched raw recruits master theirs. She did not touch the glass. She bent over it, her hands clasped hard behind her back as though she did not trust them, and she breathed in once through her nose and her face changed. "There," she said softly. "You will not smell it under the wine, or scarcely. That is the wickedness of it. But my father was assistant to an apothecary in Marbury before he died, and I grew up among the drawers and the jars, and he taught me what smells of what. Monkshood has a smell when it is strong, a green sharp bite, like nettles crushed, but wrong, like something that means you harm. And it makes the tongue tingle, then numb. A woman I knew touched the root once, thinking it horseradish, and her lips went dead as candle tallow, and she was 3 days abed. She straightened. Somebody has put a tincture of it in your wine, your grace, a strong one. Enough that a single glass would do it, and they would say it was your heart, and no one would ever be the wiser, for the signs are much like an apoplexy. Errol looked at her for a long moment. In the still room the copper pans gleamed dull red in the light of the single tallow candle, and beyond the small high window the summer night lay black and warm over his lands. "You understand," he said at last, "that this is a very great charge you make. That someone in my house, under my roof, at my own table, has attempted to murder me. That if you are wrong, you will be turned out into the road tonight without a character, and if you are lying, it will go a very great deal worse than that. I understand it, your grace, and still you say it." I saw it poured. She said the words simply, and they were the more terrible for it. I was carrying the second remove up the servant's stair with the tray, and the door to the little butler's pantry off the passage stood ajar, and I saw. A hand poured something dark from a small bottle into a goblet and swirled it, and I saw whose goblet it was because it had your crest cut in the glass, your grace, the only one so cut that you always drink from. I did not think. I only knew that if I did not stop it, a man would die, and I could not carry the tray up and stand behind your chair and watch you drink death and say nothing. I could not. Her voice cracked, just once on the last word, and she pressed her lips together and got it under control. So I said it. "I know a maid does not touch her master's glass. I know what it looks like. I have been telling myself for the last hour that I have thrown my whole life away for nothing, and I do not care, because you are alive." The Duke was silent. He had commanded men. He had sat in judgment. He had watched fine ladies and gentlemen lie to his face with perfect composure, and had learned to read the small betraying tremors beneath the polish, and he knew the way he knew his own hand, that this girl was telling him the truth. There was no calculation in her. There was only exhaustion and fear, and under both of them a stubborn, blazing decency that he had not encountered in so bare a form in a very long time. "Whose hand?" he asked, and there, for the first time, her steadiness failed a little. "I could not see the face, your grace. Only the hand and the sleeve. It was a man's hand, and the sleeve was dark, good cloth, not a footman's livery, I do not think. But the light was poor, and I saw it only a moment before I came round the door, and after that I could think of nothing but the glass." She twisted her fingers together. "I am sorry. I know that is little use to you, but I will not tell you I saw what I did not." "No," he said slowly. I begin to think you would not. He crossed to the small deal table and set the goblet down upon it, still swathed in its napkin, and he stood looking at the dark wine catching the candlelight. Someone in his household. Someone with a good coat and steady nerve, who had known which glass was his, who had chosen a poison that mimicked a natural death. This was no crime of passion. This was a plan, considered, and very nearly perfect. It had failed by the width of a scullery maid's conscience and nothing more. You said you were undercook, or you were, he said. Why the past, Winifred Prowse? She gave a small, tired, crooked smile that did something unexpected to her plain face. Because when I laid my hand upon your glass in front of all the county, your grace, I stopped being undercook and became the maid who is to be dismissed in the morning. I have made my peace with it. I only ask, if you believe me, if even a little you believe me, that you have someone taste your food before you eat it from this night on, and that you trust no cup you did not fill yourself. She dropped a curtsy, awkward and honest. That is all I wanted. I will go and pack my box. You will do no such thing. She stopped, half-turned. You are not dismissed, Errol said. He heard his own voice, and it surprised him, for there was something in it he had not put there on purpose. You are, at this moment, the only living soul in Aberborough I am prepared to trust, and I do not intend to send that soul out onto the road at midnight for the convenience of whoever wishes me dead. You will remain in this house. You will say nothing of what you saw to anyone, not the housekeeper, not the cook, not your closest friend below stairs. No one, do you understand me? As far as the world is to know, a bottle turned and the Duke was displeased, and that is the whole of it. Her eyes had gone very wide. Yes, your grace. Tomorrow you will tell me everything again slowly, and more besides, every face you can remember in that passage, every step, every sound. Tonight you will sleep, if you can, behind a locked door. He paused. And you will take nothing to eat or drink that has passed through another's hands either. Whoever did this knows the wine was refused. They will be frightened now. Frightened men are dangerous, and a frightened man who has poisoned once will not scruple to do it again, and he may begin to wonder who it was that laid a hand on the Duke's glass and why. He watched the understanding come into her face. The understanding that in saving him she had painted a mark upon her own back, and he watched her absorb it and set her jaw and refuse to flinch, and something in his hard, guarded, 10 years frozen chest turned over slowly, like an old key in a lock long rusted shut. I am not sorry I did it, she said, whatever comes. No, said the Duke of Aberborough, looking at the poison he had very nearly drunk, and at the girl who had stopped him. Nor, I find, am I. He took the goblet up again in its linen. He would keep it sealed in his own strong box. It was evidence, and he had already begun, in the cold, clear back rooms of his mind, to build the case. But even as he turned the thing over, a part of him that he had believed dead these 10 years had woken, and would not go back to sleep. A part that had watched a plain girl choose his life over her own bread, and had begun, against all his careful iron resolve, to wonder what manner of woman could do such a thing, and why the doing of it had lit her plain face like a lamp. Go to bed, Winifred Prowse, he said, more gently than he had said anything in a long while. Lock your door. Tomorrow the hunt begins, and I mean to find the hand that poured this, if I have to take Aberborough apart stone by stone to do it. The Duke did not sleep that night. He sat in his study with a single lamp burning and the sealed goblet before him on the blotter, and he watched the summer dawn come grey and then gold over the park, and he thought about who in the world might wish him dead. It was, he found, a longer list than a comfortable man's ought to be. A great name makes great enemies, a great estate makes greedy heirs. But murder, patient, poisoned, planned murder, carried out in his own hall by a hand in a good dark sleeve, that narrowed the field considerably, and every road his mind walked down led him back to the same handful of doors within his own house. There was Lionel, first and always. His cousin Lionel Vane, the son of his father's younger brother, was heir presumptive to the dukedom of Aberborough, for Errol had no child and no living brother, and by the old entail the title and the greater part of the lands would pass to Lionel the moment Errol's heart stopped beating. Lionel had debts. Errol knew this the way he knew the acreage of his own fields, quietly, thoroughly, through men he paid to know such things. Lionel kept a house in town he could not afford, and a mistress he could afford still less, and a great deal of paper had lately been signed against expectations that could only be realized over the Duke's dead body, and Lionel had been at the table. Lionel had urged him, with such tender concern, to drink and be easy. But Lionel was a fool, and this was not a fool's crime, it was too neat. Which meant that if Lionel's was the greed behind it, some clever hand had done the arranging, and Errol's thoughts turned, as they had turned all night, to the lean grey figure of Ambrose Krell, his steward. The man who kept his accounts, held his keys, hired and dismissed his servants, knew the coming and going of every soul at Aberbarrow as a spider knows its web. The man who had, for the barest instant at the table, let something show in his face before smoothing it away. A steward who chose to throw in his lot with the hare might reason it out very coldly indeed, serve the old Duke faithfully, and be pensioned off at his death, or hasten that death and be indispensable to the new one, with all the power of the place in his hands and a grateful, feckless master too indebted to ever call him to account. It was a wager Errol could imagine such a man making, and Krell had the wit for the neatness of it. He had no proof. That was the iron fact at the centre of the night. A maid's word that she had seen a dark sleeve pour a dark liquid, a goblet of wine that, when he had a trusted man ride to the next county and bring back a discreet apothecary to test it, would surely show the monk should, but would show nothing of whose hand had poured it. He could accuse no one. He could dismiss no one, for to dismiss Krell now, on a maid's word, would be to warn the whole conspiracy that he knew, and to send it underground where he could not watch it. No. He must do the hardest thing, the thing that went against every hot instinct in him. He must pretend to know nothing at all. He must smile at his cousin and take his steward's reports and eat his careful, tasted meals, and he must watch, and wait and gather, until he had a rope long enough and strong enough to hang the guilty and spare the innocent. And he must keep Winifred Prowse alive, for she was the only witness he had, and they would know it soon if they did know it already. He sent for her at 8. She came into the study still pale, but with her cap straight and her apron clean and her back very straight, and she stood before his desk with her hands folded and waited to be spoken to. He noticed things about her in the honest morning light that the candle flame had hidden. That her hands were red and cracked at the knuckles from years of cold water and lye. That her grey gown had been turned and mended so many times the mending was mended. That she was thin in the way of a person who has known real hunger and learned to carry it quietly. And that her eyes, which he had taken for merely brown, had flecks of gold in them and did not once slide away from his, she said, and gestured to the chair across the desk. She looked at it as though he had asked her to sit upon the altar of a church. Your Grace, it is not fitting. Sit, Winifred. I am too tired for the ceremony of it, and what I have to say will take a while, and I will not have you swaying on your feet halfway through and cracking your head on my floor. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. You have saved my life. You may sit in my chair without the sky falling. She sat on the very edge of it and folded her hands in her lap. He questioned her then, gently and thoroughly, the way he had questioned scouts brought in from the field. Where had she stood? Which stair? How the passage lay? What she had heard before she came round the door and what after? She answered plainly, and he saw that she had a good clear memory and did not embroider it, did not add a face where she had seen only a sleeve, did not, to please him, make her testimony neater than it was. Twice he asked her the same question in a different way to see if her story would shift, and twice it stood exactly where it had stood, unmoved. By the end he was as certain of her truthfulness as he had ever been certain of anything. The sleeve, he said. Dark good cloth, you said. Not livery. Could it have been a coat such as a gentleman wears? It could. She frowned, reaching after the memory. Or such as an upper servant wears, your Grace, a butler, or a valet, or a steward. It was black or a very dark grey. There was a button at the cuff, I think a plain one, dark, no lace. A working sort of a coat, but good. That is all I can be sure of. I have gone over it 100 times in the night, and I cannot make myself see the face, though God knows I have tried. A steward's coat. Errol kept his own face still. Tell me about yourself, he said instead. You said your father was apothecary's man in Marbury. How does a girl raised among the drawers and the jars come to be scrubbing pots in my scullery? She told him simply without any bid for pity, which somehow made the pity rise in him unbidden. Her father had been a clever, careful man who never had 2 shillings to rub together, being too honest to cheat his master and too gentle to leave him. Her mother had died when Winfred was small. When Winfred was 17, her father had been carried off by the same low fever that took so many that winter, and there had been debts, and the apothecary had turned her out with a week's wages and a jar of his best salve, which was, she said with that small crooked smile, more than she had expected of him. She had gone into service because service fed you and roofed you, and she had come to Aberborough 2 years past because the wages were 1 shilling more than at the last place, and a girl counted shillings. She had a younger brother, Tom, apprenticed to a wheelwright in Marbury, whom she had not seen in a 12-month, and to whom she sent what she could spare, which was not much. And in 2 years at Aberborough, Errol said, "You never came to my notice once." "No, your grace." Scullery maids do not come to the notice of dukes. That is rather the point of them. She said it without bitterness, as a plain statement of the order of things, and it struck him more sharply than any complaint could have. He thought of the hundreds of lives lived out beneath his feet, in the cold flagged passages and the steaming kitchens and the narrow beds under the roof, feeding him and clothing him and warming him, and how not one face of them all had been real to him until one of them had reached out of the shadow and taken the death out of his hand. "You came to my notice last night," he said. Something passed between them then, brief, and neither of them named it, and both of them felt it. She looked down at her cracked red hands in her lap, and a faint colour came up in her pale cheeks, and the Duke of Aberborough, who had not been unsettled by a woman in 10 hard years, felt distinctly unsettled and did not know what to do with it. He rose and turned to the window to give them both a moment. "Here is what will happen," he said to the glass, and his voice went crisp and cool again, the voice of a man arranging a campaign. "You will not go back to the scullery. I will not have you below stairs where any hand might reach you and where you would eat and drink from the common pot. From today you are lifted up. Mrs. Tarrow, my housekeeper, will be told that I have observed you be quick and clever, and that I wish you trained as an upper housemaid, to wait on the state-rooms and mend the fine linens, light work, clean work, and above all work that keeps you above stairs and near to trustworthy eyes. You will have a small room to yourself with a key. You will take your meals from a tray that I will see is prepared apart. It will be given out that you found favour by some small service at the dinner, and let them make of that what they will." He heard her stir behind him. "Your Grace, forgive me, but that will be noticed. The whole house will talk. A scullery girl raised up overnight, given a room and a key and dainty work. They will say," she stopped. "They will say I have taken a fancy to you," he finished, turning. Her colour had deepened, but she met his eye. "Yes, they will say it. Below stairs and above, they will say the cold Duke has warmed to a kitchen wench, and there will be a good deal of unkindness in the saying. I know it, and I am sorry for it is a hard coin to make you pay. But consider the alternative." He came back to the desk and set his hands flat upon it and leaned toward her. "If I leave you in the scullery, you are within reach of the very people who mean me harm, and who will very soon reason, if they have not already, that the maid who touched the poisoned glass must have known it was poisoned, and that a maid who knew that is a maid who saw too much, and that such a maid is a loose thread that a careful man snips off before it can be pulled. Do you follow me, Winfred?" He watched the truth of it settle into her, cold and heavy. She had known it in part already. He had warned her of it in the night, but now she understood the whole shape of it, that she was not merely at risk of dismissal, but at risk of her life, and that the danger was not a thing that would pass, but a thing that would grow. "I follow you," she said quietly. "Then let them talk," he said. "Their tongues cannot kill you. Monkshade can. I would rather you were gossiped about and alive than respectable and in the churchyard." He hesitated, and then, because he had promised himself in the small hours that he would deal honestly with this one honest person, he said it. "And I find I have a strong objection to your being in the churchyard, Winfred Prowse. Stronger than I can well account for on so short an acquaintance. So you will humour me in this." She looked up at him, and for a moment the fear went out of her face and something else came into it. Wonder, perhaps, or the first faint dangerous bloom of hope, and then she mastered it as she mastered everything, and said only, "Yes, your Grace. I will humor you. Good. He straightened, and the campaign voice returned. Now, there is one thing more, and it is the hardest, so I will say it plainly and trust you to bear it, for you have borne worse this last day than most people bear in a year. From this hour you and I are engaged in a deception, you and I together, against everyone else beneath this roof, to your fellow servants, to my cousin, to my steward, to the guests who yet remain, to all of them you must be exactly what they think you, a lucky maid raised above her station, silly with her good fortune, knowing nothing, seeing nothing, remembering nothing of that dinner but that a bottle turned. You must smile and bob and play the fool a little. It will gall you. You are not a foolish woman, and it will gall you to be thought one. But that mask is your armor, and mine until I have the guilty by the throat. Can you wear it? I scrubbed pots for 2 years and let a man who beat the boot boy call me stupid to my face and thank him for the wage, she said. I can wear a mask, your grace. I have worn worse. The plain courage of it, the flint under the mildness, went through him like the first strong draught of wine after a cold ride. He had known bold men, reckless men, men who charged cannon for glory or for one of imagination. He had not often known this, a quiet, undramatic, bone-deep steadiness, a person who simply did the right and dangerous thing because it was the right thing, and then squared her shoulders to pay for it. Then we understand each other, he said. Go to Mrs. Tarot. She will be sharp with you, for she does not like surprises, and she will like this one least of all, but bear it. And Winifred, she paused at the door. Bolt your door tonight, and every night. I mean to see this through to the end, and I mean for you to be standing beside me when we reach it, alive and well and vindicated before the whole of them. But between here and there lies a stretch of very dark country, and I'll not have you walk it careless, nor you your grace, she said. You'll mind your own cup as I mind my own door. It surprised a short, rough sound out of him that he realized, a moment later, was a laugh, the first in longer than he could remember. I'll mind my cup, he said. She curtsied and went out, and the Duke of Aberbrove stood alone in his study with the sealed poison on his desk, and the enemy still smiling somewhere in his house, and found that the dark country ahead of him seemed, unaccountably, a little less dark than it had an hour before. Mrs. Tarot received the news of the maid's elevation exactly as he had foretold she would, which was badly. The housekeeper of Aberbrove was a starched and upright woman of near 60 who had risen to her place through 40 years of merciless propriety, and the notion of a scullery girl being lifted overnight into the upper rooms offended every ordered fibre of her being. She came to him stiff with disapproval, her keys chiming at her waist like a small indignant bell, and stood before his desk and asked, with the terrible respectfulness of a servant who means to be heard, whether his grace was quite certain, for the girl Prowse was a good enough worker, but lo, sir? Lo, with no training in the fine work and no notion of the ways of the upper house, and the other maids would resent it sorely, and it would set the whole hall by the ears. It very likely will, Mrs. Tarot, the Duke agreed. Set it by the ears, then. I have my reasons, and they are good ones, and they are mine. You need not approve of the girl. You need only train her, feed her from the tray I have ordered kept apart, and see that she sleeps in a room with a key to it. Can you do that much for me, after 30 years? Something in his voice, a gravity beneath the command that she had served him long enough to recognize, checked the housekeeper's protest in her throat. She looked at him a moment longer, and then at the sealed goblet still standing on the corner of his desk where he had not troubled to hide it, and though she could not have said what she read there, she read something, for her starched manner softened by a degree. I will do it, your grace, she said, though the hall will talk. Let the hall talk, said the Duke for the second time that day. It is what halls are for. So Winifred Prowse went up out of the scullery, and the hall talked exactly as everyone had promised it would. She bore it as she had said she would bear it, with her chin up and her foolish lucky mask fixed in place, and if the resentment of the other maids was a hard bread to eat, she ate it in silence and did not let the Duke see. But he saw more than she knew. He had begun, since the night of the dinner, to move about his own house with different eyes, to notice the flagged passages and the cold stares and the small unremarked lives that ran beneath his grand and ordered days. And so he saw the sidelong looks that followed her, and the whispered spite and the way she squared her thin shoulders to it and carried on. And it did something to him that he was not prepared for, this small daily courage, so much less than the courage of the poisoned glass, and yet, in its patient way, so much more. He passed her once on the gallery in those first hard days, an armful of clean linen against her breast, and she stood aside and bobbed him a curtsy with 2 other maids looking on, and played her part, foolish and pleased. But as he went by he said, low, under the cover of his own footsteps, meant for her alone, steady, Winifred Prowse, it will not always be so, and he did not stop, and did not look back, and gave her nothing to be caught at. But he saw, in the corner of his eye, her chin come up another half-inch, and knew that the small word had reached her, and was glad of it, and was troubled by his own gladness, and walked on. The apothecary came 3 days later, riding in from the far side of the county in a plain coat, a discreet old man who owed the Duke a favour and asked no questions. He took the sealed goblet into a locked room and worked over it with his little glasses and his papers of powder for the better part of an hour, and when he came out his face was grave. "Aconate your grace," he said, "what the country folk call monkshood, or wolfspan. A tincture of the root, and a strong one, stronger than any physician would ever prescribe, for physic uses it only in the smallest doses, and this is enough to stop a bull's heart. There is no mistaking it. Whoever mixed this knew precisely what they were about. This was not the blunder of a careless cook. This was murder, sir, and a knowing one. So the maid had been right to the letter, and the Duke had known she would be, and still it was a cold thing to hear it confirmed by a man of science in a locked room. Paid the apothecary well and swore him to silence and watched him ride away, and then he went and stood a long while at the window of the long gallery, looking out over the park where the deer moved under the great old oaks, and let the knowledge settle into his bones. Someone in this house wanted him dead so badly that they had reached for one of the cruelest deaths there was, and had very nearly had it, and would try again. He felt no fear. He had left fear behind somewhere on a battlefield years ago. What he felt was a cold, clear, patient anger, and beneath it, surprising him, a thread of something warmer, which was the memory of a red cracked hand closing over his goblet in the candlelight. In the days that followed, Errol became a hunter in his own house. He changed nothing that could be seen. He rode out to look at his farms as he always did. He took his cousin Lionel shooting and endured his chatter and watched him, and saw a man forever glancing at the Duke's face to read his mood. Forever steering the talk to money in 100 small oblique ways, but saw too that Lionel drank too much and boasted too much and started at shadows, and grew more and more convinced that his cousin was a weak vessel who might carry a wicked wish, but had neither the nerve nor the wit to mix a poison and pour it steady. Lionel was a man who would inherit a murder gladly. He was not, Errol judged, a man who could commit one. Krell was another matter. The Duke watched his steward with the patience of a man watching a snake in long grass. He found reasons to have Krell about him, accounts to go over, tenants to discuss, the ordering of the cellar, and under the cover of business he studied the man as he had never troubled to study him in 11 years. He noted how Krell's eyes went always to the Duke's plate and glass at table, and how, since the night of the dinner, a certain tension had come into the steward's grey composure, a watchfulness, the wariness of a man who has thrown a stone and is waiting to hear where it falls. He noted that Krell had, of late, taken to going down to the village himself of an evening on errands he might easily have sent a boy to do, and when Errol quietly set one of his own gamekeepers, a taciturn man named Harl, loyal to the Duke's late father before him and to Errol after, and beholden to no one in the house, to follow the steward at a distance and mark where he went, he learned that Krell's evening errands took him not to the village at all, but by a back lane to the gates of a house 3 miles off, where a widow lived alone with cold bright eyes and expensive tastes and a great deal of quiet ambition, Lady Sibylla Cray, who had sat at his table the night of the poisoning, whose late husband had left her handsome and restless and reaching, who was, Errol now recalled, a distant connection of his cousin Lionel's, and had lately been much in Lionel's company in town. The shape of it began to come clear to him, the way a coastline comes clear out of fog. Not a lone madman, a conspiracy of 3, each supplying what the others lacked. Lionel, the heir, who would inherit and who could pay. Lady Sibylla, the clever cold ambition of the thing, who meant, Errol did not doubt, to marry the new young Duke Lionel once the old one was safely underground and rule Aberborough from behind him. And Krell, the steward, the hand and the head of it, the man inside the walls who knew which glass was the Duke's and could reach it, who would be rewarded past a servant's wildest dreams for the doing, 3 threads. He had begun to see all 3. He did not yet have proof enough to hang a dog upon, but he could see them now, and a man who can see his enemies is halfway to defeating them. Through all of it, there was Winifred. He had not meant to notice her so much. He had lifted her up out of danger and out of a hard duty to a witness, and he had told himself that his interest in her was the interest of a general in a valuable scout, no more. But the house is a small world for all its grandeur, and a duke who has been made suddenly aware of one particular servant finds her everywhere. He saw her on the gallery stair with an armful of clean linen, and she bobbed him a curtsy and played her foolish lucky maid part for the benefit of the footman behind her, but her eyes over the linen met his for half a heartbeat with a flash of shared and secret knowledge, and it warmed him absurdly. He saw her at the far end of the Rose Walk one evening, sitting alone on a stone bench in the last of the light with her mending in her lap, her cap off and her brown hair coming loose, and he found that his feet had carried him halfway across the grass toward her before he recalled himself and stopped and stood in the shadow of the yew and simply watched her a while and did not know his own heart. There was one evening in that fortnight that he did not afterward forget, though nothing happened in it that a stranger looking on could have named. He had come down late to the small dining parlour, where he took his solitary suppers when there was no company, and Winifred had been sent up with the tray, his tray, the one prepared apart, that only trusted hands touched. For 2 of the upper servants were abed with summer colds, and the house was short-handed again, as it always seemed to be. She set the dishes before him without a word, playing her part for the footman at the door, and would have withdrawn, but he dismissed the footman on some errand, and when the door had closed he said quietly, "Sit with me a moment, there is no one to see. I am weary of eating alone under guard like a prisoner, and I would rather have your company than my own thoughts, which are poor supper." She hesitated, and then she sat, on the edge of the chair as she always sat, and folded her red hands, and watched him eat with a frank open interest that would have been impertinent in a courtier, and was in her simply honest. "You taste it first, Mrs. Tarot tells me," he said. "Each dish, before it comes up. I did not order that." "No, your grace, I ordered it of myself." She said it plainly. "It seemed to me that if there is poison to be met in this house, it had better meet someone who knows the taste and smell of it and can raise the cry, rather than come fresh upon you at the table with no warning. I know the numbing of the tongue now. I would feel it and spint and shout before ever it did more than sting me. So I taste. It is no great matter." He set down his fork. "It is a very great matter," he said. "You are telling me that you eat my poison for me, if there is any to eat." "I am telling you I taste it," she said, colouring. "It is not the same. A taste is not a swallow. Winifred." He looked at her until she looked back. "You are not to do that. Do you hear me? I will not have you set yourself between me and the poison a 3rd time. Twice is more than any man has a right to ask of anyone, and I did not ask it even once. If there is tasting to be done, I will pay a man to do it, a man who has taken the king's shilling for danger and knows the bargain. I will not have it be you. And if the paid man is careless, or bribed, or slow," she lifted her chin, "you cannot pay a man to care, your grace. That is the one thing that cannot be bought, and it is the only thing that saved you the first time. So I will go on tasting, and you may command me all you like. For I find that in this one thing I am disobedient, and there is nothing you can do about it short of turning me out, and you have said you will not do that." And she folded her hands again and looked at him with such mild, immovable stubbornness that the Duke of Aberborough, master of 10,000 acres and the terror of the county, found that he had, for once in his life, been entirely defeated, and by a scullery maid, across his own supper table, and that he did not mind it in the least, and could not for the life of him say why the losing warmed him so. He took to finding reasons to speak with her. He would have her sent for on the pretext of some small commission, a book fetched, a message carried, and then keep her a quarter-hour in talk, and tell himself it was to hear whether she had recalled any further detail of that night, and know that it was not. She had a dry quick wit under her quietness that he had not looked for. She saw people clearly and described them without malice, and with a maid's shrewd knowledge of what the great do not trouble to hide from their servants. She made him laugh, a thing so rare in him that the first time it happened in front of Mrs. Tarot the housekeeper dropped a candlestick. And when he spoke, she listened as though what he said mattered, not because he was a duke and it was politic to seem to listen, but because she was actually turning his words over and weighing them, and would tell him, respectfully but plainly, when she thought him wrong. No one had told the Duke of Edinburgh he was wrong in a very long time. He found to his considerable surprise that he had missed it. He knew what the house was saying. He was not a stupid man. He knew the sniggers below stairs and the raised brows above them, knew that his cousin had begun to watch the girl with a new and calculating interest, knew that every hour he spent in her company made her more talked of and therefore, in a way he could not quite pass, more exposed. He told himself he would be more careful. He was not more careful. A man 10 years frozen who feels the thaw begin does not easily step back from the fire. And then, on a wet grey afternoon a fortnight after the dinner, the enemy moved again, and this time they did not aim at him. He was in the library when Harl the gamekeeper came in without knocking, wet through and grim, and said, "Your Grace, you'd best come. The maid prowls, she's been took bad." The Duke was on his feet before he knew he had risen. They had found her, Harl said as they went fast through the passages, collapsed on the floor of the little upstairs still room, where she had gone to fetch a cordial for her supper tray, as she always did, taking her drink from a bottle she filled herself from the pump, and dosed with a spoonful of the elder cordial the housekeeper kept there for the upper servants. She had drunk, and within minutes had been seized with a burning in the mouth and a numbness of the lips and a terrible sickness, and had had the wit, even as it took her, to thrust her fingers down her own throat and rid herself of most of it, and to crawl to the door and cry out before her legs failed her. That wit had likely saved her, but she was grey and cold and shaking when the Duke reached her, curled on the flagstones with a scared kitchen girl kneeling by her, and when he went down on his knees beside her. The Duke of Edinburgh on the floor of a still room in front of servants, and took her cold face in his 2 hands. Her eyes found his, and she tried to speak and could not, and the terror that went through him then was of a kind he had believed himself long past feeling. "Send Harl for the physician and no other," he heard himself say in a voice like iron. "Ride, man, and bring me the bottle she drank from and the cordial jar, sealed, touched by no one. Go." He carried her himself. He would not let another hand take her. He gathered her up off the cold stone. She weighed nothing. She weighed less than his sword and shield had used to weigh, and he bore her through the astonished house and up the great stair and laid her on the bed in the best guest chamber, the blue room with the good fire, and would not hear a word about it being unfitting. He sat by her while the numbness spread and receded, while the sickness racked her and passed, while Mrs. Tarot, white-faced and for once entirely without ceremony, worked over her with warm bricks and weak broth, and the old sure remedies of women who have nursed the poisoned and the fevered all their lives. And when at last, near midnight, the worst of it broke and Winifred slept, truly slept, her breathing evening out and a little colour creeping back into her lips, the Duke found that his own hands were not quite steady, and that he had been holding one of hers for some hours without any clear memory of having taken it. The physician had come and gone and confirmed what Errol already knew. Aconite again in the cordial jar this time, the same poison, the same hand, aimed now not at the master but at the witness. They had grown frightened, exactly as he had foretold. They had reasoned out that the maid who touched the glass had known, and they had moved to snip the loose thread. And they had chosen the cordial jar because they knew someone in the house knew, someone who watched the upper servant's small habits, that Winifred Prowse dosed her nightly drink from it and no one else troubled with it. That narrowed the field again, and hard. It was the knowledge of a person who moved freely among the upper servants and marked their ways. It was the knowledge of a steward. But it was not proof. It would never, God help him, be proof, not so long as the hand stayed hidden. And now the cost of the game had changed entirely, for it was no longer only his own life he was wagering across the board, but hers. He looked at her sleeping face in the firelight, plain and pale, and dear to him now past all his cold reasoning. Dear in a way that frightened him more than any poison, and he made her a promise, silently, the kind of promise a hard man makes only once or twice in a life and keeps though the sky falls. No more, he said very low. They will not touch you again. If I have to burn out this whole nest of them and stand alone in the ashes, they will not touch you again. I swear it, Winifred Prowse. You reached into the dark and pulled me out of it, and I am done letting the dark reach back for you. She did not wake, but her fingers in his tightened for a moment, as though somewhere far down in her poisoned sleep she had heard him, and the Duke of Aberbrove sat on through the long night at the bedside of a scullery maid, keeping watch, as no duke in the long proud history of that house had ever kept watch before. She was 3 days abed, and the Duke was at her side more of those 3 days than a great man with an estate to run had any business to be. He brought her things himself, which scandalized the house past all bearing. He brought her hothouse grapes from his own succession houses, and a shawl of soft grey wool, and a little pot of the very salve her father's master had turned her out with, which he had a man ride to Marbury to purchase, remembering the story she had told him, and when she understood what it was, and that he had remembered, she turned her face to the pillow and wept silently, the first tears he had seen her shew all the fear and the poison, and he sat and did not touch her and let her weep, and understood that he had reached something in her that no grape or shawl could have reached, which was the simple undoing fact of being remembered by someone who did not have to. On the second day she was well enough to sit up and be angry, which cheered him enormously. "You cannot keep sitting here, your grace," she said low, so the maid nodding by the door should not hear. "You must see what it does. The whole county will have it by now that the Duke sits day and night by the bed of a kitchen girl in his best guest chamber. Lady this and lady that will be dining out on it for a month. Your cousin looks at me as though I were a stain on his inheritance. Mrs. Tarrow does not know whether to curtsy to me or box my ears. You are making me into a scandal, sir, and a scandal is a fine bright thing that everyone can see, and I had thought the whole of our plan was that no one should see me at all. The plan has changed," he said. "Has it? Or has the Duke changed and dressed it up as a plan?" That struck close, and he did not answer it at once, because he was an honest man when he was cornered, and he had asked himself the same hard question in the watches of the night. He rose and went to the window and looked out at the rain on the park. "They tried to kill you, Winifred," he said at last. "Not me, because of what you did for me. Whatever this began as, a witness to be guarded, a scout to be kept safe, it is not that any longer, and I will not insult you by pretending it is. I sat on the floor of my own still room with your face going grey in my hands, and I discovered a thing about myself that I did not know and cannot now unknow." He turned. "So yes, the Duke has changed, and he is too old and too tired to dress it up as anything but what it is. I would rather have you a living scandal than a respectable memory. Let the county dine out on me. I have fed them worse dishes." She was very quiet. The rain ticked on the glass. "You must not say such things to me, your grace," she said finally, and her voice was not steady. It is not kind, though you mean it kindly. Men like you and women like me do not. There is no country where that road leads anywhere but grief, and mostly the grief is the woman's. I know my place. I have kept it all my life. I beg you will not stand there being wonderful at me and make me forget it, because I have nothing in the world but my place and my good name, and when this is over and the danger past, you will still be the Duke of Aberbrove, and I will still be Winifred Prowse who scrubbed your pots. And the wanting of things one cannot have is the surest way I know to a broken heart. And if I told you," he said slowly, "that I do not consider what I want to be a thing I cannot have, but a thing I have not yet asked for properly, and mean to, when I have cleared the road of the men who would murder us both." She looked at him with her gold-flecked eyes wide and stricken, and full of a hope she was plainly terrified to hold, and she opened her mouth, and no words came, and in the end she only pressed her lips together and shook her head, not in refusal but in a kind of overwhelmed defense, as though he had offered her more than a person who had known only hunger and cold water knew how to carry. "Do not answer now," he said gently. "I did not ask, so there is nothing to answer. Get well. That is all I require of you today." Get well, and be stubborn and box the housekeeper's ears if she deserves it, and let me deal with the rest. The county meanwhile came to look. They came in their carriages on the pretext of inquiring after the Duke's health, these ladies of the neighbouring great houses, and stayed to satisfy their curiosity about the Maid, for the story had run through the shire like fire through stubble. The cold Duke of Urbaborough, 10 years a stone, sitting day and night at the bedside of a kitchen girl. Errol received a few of them, because to refuse all would be to confirm every whisper, and he sat in his drawing-room and endured their probing sweetness with a face of granite. The worst of them was a Lady Marchburn, a great florid woman with a small cold mouth, who had 3 plain daughters she had been angling at the Duke for a decade, and who could not keep the spite from showing through her civility. "They tell me," said Lady Marchburn, stirring her tea, "that the girl who fell ill is quite recovered, and is being kept, how shall one put it, very snug indeed, in the Blue Chamber, I hear, with grapes from your Grace's own houses." She smiled her small cold smile. "How very Christian of you to take such trouble over a servant, though one does wonder, Duke, whether it is quite kind, in the end, to the girl I mean, to lift her up so, and let her forget what she is. It can only end in her being cast down again the harder, when your Grace tires of the novelty. These little attachments never last, and it is always the poor creature herself who pays for them. Someone ought to tell her so for her own good." The Duke set down his cup. The room grew very slightly colder. Someone ought, he agreed. "Perhaps you would care to tell her yourself, Lady Marchburn. She is above stairs. I am sure a woman of your evident kindness could find the words, though I should warn you first of 1 or 2 facts you appear to lack, so that you do not embarrass yourself. The girl of whom you speak is named Winifred Prowse. 3 weeks ago she saw a hand pour poison into my glass at my own table, and rather than carry the tray up and hold her tongue and keep her place, she laid her hand upon the Duke of Uberborough's wine before the whole of the county and cried a warning, knowing it would very likely cost her everything she had in the world. She saved my life, Lady Marchburn, at the certain price of her own bread and the possible price of her own neck. And then, some days after, the same hand that poisoned me poisoned her, for what she had seen, and she very nearly died of it in agony on a stone floor, and had the wit and the courage, even as it took her, to save her own life a second time." He looked at the florid woman until her small cold mouth had gone quite still. "So when you speak to me of what she is, and of what is kind, I will tell you what she is. She is the bravest and the most honest soul beneath this roof, and there is not a powdered lady in this county fit to carry up her tray. You asked whether it was kind to lift her up. Madam, I begin to think the only unkindness in the whole affair was that a house such as mine ever put such a woman down." There was a silence in the drawing-room such as Lady Marchburn had not sat in since her governess days. She gathered her plain daughters and her wounded consequence, and made her farewells very shortly after, and the story she carried home was not the one she had come to fetch. And by the next Sunday the whole shire knew that the Duke of Uberborough's had defended his kitchen maid to Lady Marchburn's face, and named her the bravest soul under his roof, and the county, which loved nothing so much as a scandal, unless it were a romance, did not quite know which of the two it was watching, and settled in delightedly to find out. Winifred heard of it, of course. There were no secrets below stairs nor above. She came to him that evening, pink and distressed, and told him he really must not defend her so, for it only made the talk the louder and did her no good in the end and did him harm. And the Duke looked at her and said that he had spent 10 years saying nothing while people said what they liked, and had found it a poor bargain, and that he meant to spend whatever years remained to him saying exactly what was true, and that if the truth happened to be that Winifred Prowse was the bravest soul at Aberborough, then the county could hear it as often as he chose to say it. And she gave up arguing with him, because there was, she was learning, no arguing with the man once his jaw was set, and went away with her heart in a state she did not dare examine too closely, but dealing with the rest grew harder by the day, for the enemy had smelled the change in the wind. They had failed twice now, once at the master and once at the witness, and both attempts had somehow come to nothing, and the Duke of Uberborough's, who ought by every calculation to be dead in the family vault, was instead very much alive and grown suddenly, dangerously attentive. Errol could feel the fear rising off the conspiracy like heat off a stone. His cousin Lionel had gone from oily to jumpy. He made excuses to shorten his stay, then found excuses to lengthen it again, unable to leave the scene and unable to bear it, drinking harder and sleeping worse. Krell's grey composure had begun, very slightly, to crack. Twice Errol caught him in some small unnecessary lie about the accounts, the fumbling of a man whose nerve is going. And Lady Sibylla Cray, who had left after the dinner, came back to the neighbourhood on a thin pretext and installed herself at the house 3 miles off, close enough to hold her frightened confederates together and stiffen their failing courage. They would move again. Errol was as sure of it as he had ever been sure of an enemy's next stroke. Frightened men who have gone too far to turn back do not stop. They grow reckless and reach for a bolder throw, because the alternative to winning is now the gallows, and they know it. He had only to be ready. And he had, at last, begun to gather the thread that might hang them. It was Winifred who gave it to him in the end from her sickbed, and it was so like her that he could have laughed. The poison, she said, on the 3rd day, propped on her pillows with the grey shawl round her shoulders. You have been chasing the hand that poured it, your grace, and I understand you cannot prove the hand, but you are forgetting the other end of the thread. Monkshood tincture of that strength does not fall out of the sky. Someone made it or bought it. The root grows wild enough. It is a common enough flower in a cottage garden. Folk grow it for the blue of it, not knowing what it is. But to draw off a tincture so strong and so sure takes knowing, and knowing takes an apothecary, or a still, or a book. My father used to say the poison is the easy part. It is the buying of it that hangs the poisoner, for a man remembers who came asking for wolfsbane. She looked at him. Find who bought it, or who asked how to make it. That is a hand you can put a face to. Errol sat very still, and then he took her hand off the coverlet and pressed it to his lips, once plainly before either of them could think better of it. You, he said, are worth 10 of my agents and all my lawyers together, and I have been a fool not to see it sooner. Rest. I will hunt at the other end of the thread. He set Harl and 2 other trusted men to it quietly, riding the county, asking in the discreet way of men who serve a great house, at every apothecary and herb seller and market stall within a day's ride, who, in the weeks before the great dinner, had come asking after monkshood, after wolfsbane, after the drawing of tinctures from poisonous roots. It took 4 days, and it came back, as such things do, from the least likely quarter, a poor half-blind herb woman in a village to the north, who for a few pence would sell you simples for the tooth-ache or charms for the warts, and who remembered, because it had frightened her, that a fine gentleman in a good dark coat had come to her stall on market day and asked, very particular, about the making of a strong physic from the blue monkshood flower, and had paid her a whole crown for the telling, and had told her to keep her mouth shut, which she had done until a grim quiet man of the Duke's put another crown in her hand, and a kind of fear in her heart that was worse than the gentleman's. A fine gentleman in a good dark coat, not the steward, then in his own person. Krell would never have shown his own face on such an errand. Which meant the gentleman was one of the other 2, playing at being clever, doing the one part of the business that could not be trusted to a servant, because it required the confidence of a gentleman to carry off. Errol had the herb woman brought, gently and secretly, to a farmhouse on the edge of his land, and housed there in comfort and safety, and asked her the one question that mattered. Would she know the gentleman again if she saw him? Aye, said the old woman, for he had a white scar on the back of his hand, sir, where he set it on my board, a white seam like a burn, across the knuckles, that I marked because it was ugly on so fine a hand. The Duke of Eberborough sat back in the plain farmhouse chair, and something went cold and quiet and certain in him, for he knew that scar. He had seen it 100 times across his own table, curled about a wine-glass, gesturing at some jest. His cousin Lionel Vane had burned the back of his hand as a boy, snatching a chestnut from the fire on a dare, and bore the white seam of it still. So there it was. The hare had bought the knowledge of the poison. The steward near certainly had mixed it and poured it and reached the second dose into the cordial jar, and the widow with the cold bright eyes had bound the 2 of them together and steadied their nerve and meant to marry the winnings. He had all 3 now, a coastline out of the fog, whole and clear. He had a witness to the pouring, a witness to the buying, a chemist's proof of the poison, and a scar he could put a name to. It was not yet a rope. A clever lawyer could yet fray it. But it was enough at last to stop only watching, and to begin to close his hand. He rode home through the summer dusk with the plan assembling itself in his mind, cold and precise, the old campaigning part of him fully awake now and glad almost of the work. He would not go to the magistrate yet with a half-braided rope and let the lawyers fray it. He would draw them out. He would make himself seem careless, softened, off his guard, a duke grown foolish over a servant girl, his attention all on the sick room, ripe for a bold last stroke. And he would set the stage for that stroke himself and choose the ground, and have his witnesses and his loyal men placed in waiting, so that when the frightened, cornered, reckless three reached for their boldest throw, they would reach into a trap that closed on all of them at once. In front of witnesses enough to hang them past any lawyer's unravelling. It was a dangerous game. It used himself as the bait, and that he did not mind. What he minded, what he turned over and over as his horse carried him home under the first stars, was that the surest bait of all, the piece that would draw the enemy most certainly into the open, was not himself at all. It was the maid in the blue guest room with the gold-flecked eyes, whom they had tried twice to kill, and whom he had sworn on his soul they would never touch again. He would have to risk her to save them both. And he did not know yet how he would bring himself to do it, or whether, when the moment came, the Iron Duke of Abubarov would find that somewhere in these last weeks he had grown a heart too tender for the coldness his own plan required. In the end, he did not have to decide how to use her as bait, because the enemy, grown desperate, chose the ground themselves, and chose it worse than the Duke would have. He had laid his own careful trap. He had let it be known, through the loose-lipped channels he knew ran straight to his cousin's ear, that he meant to hold a great supper at midsummer to mark his tenant's harvest. A grand set-piece dinner such as had nearly killed him once already, and he had let it be understood that the maid Prowse, now recovered, would that night be brought up out of the servants' hall to be honoured before the company for some unnamed service, a gesture at once so pointed and so scandalous that the whole county buzzed with it. It was bait laid on bait, the Duke off his guard at a grand table, and the dangerous witness exposed in the open, both together, one glittering irresistible opportunity for men who needed to be rid of both before the Duke's softness turned to suspicion. He had his loyal men marked and placed. He had the magistrate, Sir Halloran, a hard, honest old man who owed nothing to Lionel and disliked Lady Sibylla on sight, quietly forewarned and lodged in the house as a guest, and Harl and the apothecary and the herb woman held ready. He had built the box. He had only to let them walk into it. But the frightened do not wait for your box. 2 days before the midsummer supper, they moved. Errol had ridden out at first light to a far farm on a matter of drainage, taking Harl with him, and he had been 3 hours gone when the boy came galloping after him bareback, and white as milk with the word that turned his blood to river ice. The maid Prowse was gone, not sick, not fallen, gone. Walked out, they said, in the early morning to gather elderflower along the north lane as she had done a dozen mornings for the still room, and not come back, and her basket found and trampled at the field gate where the lane met the wood, and the marks of a horse and of men's boots in the soft ground, and no maid. They had taken her. The Duke turned his horse's head for home and rode as he had not ridden since the wars, and the cold cart of his mind, even through the roaring of his heart, laid the thing out plain. They had seen the whole design of his supper, the honouring of the witness, the trap he thought so clever, and they had seen too, being cornered animals now and sharp with fear, exactly where his weakness lay. They had taken her not merely to silence the witness, but to draw the teeth of the Duke himself, for a man half in love does not spring his trap when the girl is in the enemy's hands. They had turned his own softness into a bit and bridle. They meant to use her to make him come to them, alone, on their ground and their terms, to trade his own life quietly and unwitnessed for hers, so that both loose threads should be snipped at once in a lonely place with no magistrate to see. It was the boldest, cruelest, cleverest throw of the whole game, and it was, Errol understood with a sick lurch, very likely to work, because they had reckoned rightly on the one thing he could not master, which was that he would give his own life without a moment's bargaining to keep hers. He reached the house at a gallop with his horse blowing foam, and flung himself down in the stable yard, and the first face he saw was Mrs. Tarrow's grey and stricken, her starch all gone out of her, wringing her hands in her apron in a way he had never seen from that upright woman in 30 years. She had been the one to raise the alarm when the girl did not come back with the elderflower. She had sent the boys running to search the lanes, and now she stood before her master with the news breaking her voice and said, "Your Grace, I would to God I had never spoken against her. She is the best of them, sir, the best of all of them, and I called her low to your face. And now they have taken her, and it is on me, for I never once thought to have her watched when she went out, though you told me to guard her." And the old woman's face crumpled entirely, and the Duke, who had no comfort in him to spare, for his own heart was a stone dropping through black water, put his hand once upon her shoulder as he passed hard, and said only, "Then help me get her back, and we will neither of us speak of blame. Rouse the house, quietly, and send Harl to me the moment he comes in." It steadied her, the work did, as work steadies the frightened. She went to rouse the house, and the Duke went into his study and shut the door and stood a moment with his back against it and his eyes shut, and let himself feel, for exactly the space of 10 breaths, the full and unbearable weight of it, that they had her, that she was in the hands of the men who had already poisoned her once, that every hour he did not find her was an hour she spent in terror waiting for a death he had brought upon her by loving her. And then he opened his eyes and put the feeling away in the cold locked room where a soldier learns to keep such things, and became once more the hunter. Feeling would not save her. Only the cold clear campaigning mind would save her, the mind that had brought whole regiments living out of worse ground than this. He would grieve later, or he would rejoice later. Now he would think. The note came at noon, brought by a village boy who had been paid a penny by a stranger and could tell them nothing. It was unsigned in a disguised hand, and it was brief. The Duke was to come that night, alone, unarmed and unattended, to the old ruined mill on the river at the edge of his own land, and there he would find the maid alive, and there certain matters might be settled between gentlemen to the satisfaction of all. And if he came with men, or with the law, or failed to come at all, the maid would be found in the mill race in the morning, drowned, as girls sometimes are, and no one the wiser. He was to burn the note. He was to tell no one. He had until midnight. Errol read it twice, and then he set it down and stood very still, and Harl, watching his master's face, said afterward that he had never in 40 years seen a man look so like death and so entirely calm at once. For the Duke's fury, which was very great, had gone all the way through heat and out the far side into a cold so absolute it was almost peace. They thought they had trapped him with his own heart. They had. But they had reckoned, as such people always reckon, only with the softness of love and never with its teeth. They had made 2 errors, and he had already found them both. The first was that they had assumed a man in love would come stupidly, throwing his life away in a straight line, and so he would let them think. He would go to the mill alone, as bidden, walking openly into their trap. And the second was that they'd not know he had spent his youth in a harder school than theirs, and that a trap walked into with open eyes by a man who has laid his own men in the reeds is not a trap at all, but the very box he had wanted, only moved 3 miles and 2 days early. He did not burn the note. He gave into the hard old hands of Sir Halloran the magistrate, and told him everything, from the whisper at the dinner to the scar on his cousin's hand, and the old man's face grew grimmer and grimmer, and at the end he said only, "Then we shall be there before you, Your Grace, in the reeds and the ruins, the whole quiet weight of the law, and we shall see these gentlefolk take a scullery maid from a mill race, shall we, and hang for it in front of the county." And Errol laid his plan, and placed his men, Harl and the keepers who could move through a wood like shadows, and the magistrate's officers, and himself at the front of it as the bait that would draw the confession out of them in the open where witnesses could hear, and then, because there were long hours yet to fill and his heart was a stone in him, he went up alone to the blue room where she had lain sick and sat a while on the edge of the bed where he had held her cold hand, and made himself a second promise to match the first. Winfried Prowse meanwhile was not drowned and did not mean to be. They had bound her wrists and shut her in the little upper room of the ruined mill, a dry stone chamber above the wheel race with one small barred window, and a door they had wedged, and they had not, in their gentleman's contempt, thought a bound and frightened maid worth much watching. They were wrong about her, as everyone in this story who underestimated her was wrong. She was frightened, she was no fool, and she knew exactly the sort of morning they meant her to have, but under the fright the old hard steadiness held. The steadiness of a girl who had buried her father, and been turned into the road and scrubbed pots in the cold and survived it all, and she did not spend her terror in weeping. She spent it in watching and thinking, the way she had watched and thought over a poisoned glass in the candlelight. She had heard their voices through the floor in the mill room below. She had heard the widow's cold clear tones, and her cousin, the Duke's cousin, she corrected herself, for she had heard Lionel's frightened bluster plain enough, and she had heard the third voice, dry and grey and reasoning, laying out to the other two exactly how the night should go, and it was the voice that had given her her first true fright, because she knew it, and knew now, past any doubt, whose dark good-clothed sleeve had poured the death into the Duke's glass. Mr. Krell, the steward. Reasoning it out in his closing door voice, the Duke would come being besotted. They would have the maid drowned first, quietly, before ever he arrived, so there should be no scene of her. A dead maid tells no tales and makes no cries, and then the Duke, arriving to find her gone and himself alone in a lonely place with three who wished him dead, would suffer his sad accident, a fall in the dark, a crack on the head on the millstones, a drowning of his own, and in the morning a grieving hare and a magistrate would find a maddened, lovesick Duke who had killed a servant girl, and then himself in his shame, and the whole county would cluck and believe it, for was it just such a scandal as they'd all been whispering these weeks past? They meant to drown her before the Duke ever came. That was the thing Winefred understood, lying bound in the dark stone room, and it changed everything, for it meant she could not wait to be rescued. She had to be alive and free, and where the Duke could see her before their patience turned to action, or the trap he was surely walking into. For she knew him, she knew he would come, the great stubborn tender fool, would close on nothing. So she did what her father's daughter would do. She had marked when they thrust her in, an old iron nail standing proud of the doorframe, red with rust, at the height of her hip, and through the long grey afternoon and into the dusk, working in silence, hidden from the bowed window, Winifred Prowse sawed the cords at her wrists back and forth against that rusted nail, till the rope frayed and her wrists ran red and her arms shook, and at last, near dark, the last strand parted and her hands were free. And then, rather than break for the door and be caught, she made herself wait and think, and be cleverer than her fear. Because a maid who bursts out shouting is a maid recaptured, but a maid who is patient may yet turn her captor's own trap around upon them, the way she had once turned a poison from a whisper into a rescue. She crept to the bowed window and looked out into the falling dark over the mill pond. And in the last of the light she saw, or thought she saw, low among the reeds on the far bank, a shape that did not move as reeds move, and then another and another, still and waiting, ranged all along the cover of the wood. And Winifred Prowse, bound no longer, her heart hammering with a wild and terrible hope, understood that the Duke had not come stupidly to trade his life for hers after all. He had come with the reeds full of men, and all that was needed now, to spring the true trap shut on the three below her, was for the maid they thought helpless in the milleress to be, instead standing free and alive and speaking in the open when the Duke walked in, so that every ear in that ruin should hear the guilty condemn themselves, and no lawyer on earth could ever unpick it. She set her back to the wedged door, and her freed and bleeding hands flat against the old wood, and she began very carefully, very quietly, to work it loose. The Duke of Aberbroof walked into the ruined mill a little before midnight, alone, unarmed, and open-handed, exactly as they had bidden him, and every step he took was a lie, for behind him in the dark the reeds were full of the law. He came in under the broken arch with a single lantern held low, and the light of it fell on the three of them ranged across the old grinding floor, among the rotted gears and the fallen stones, and he looked at each in turn and let them see that he was not afraid. His cousin Lionel stood nearest, and Lionel was sweating, a pistol shaking in his soft scarred hand, his handsome face gone slack and grey with a fear far greater than the Duke's. Behind him, seated on a fallen beam as composed as a lady at her own tea-table, was Lady Sibylla Cray, her cold bright eyes moving over the Duke with the calm calculating pleasure of a cat that believes the mouse already caught. And a little apart, in the shadows by the wheel shaft where a man might come and go unremarked, stood Ambrose Krell the steward, grey and dry and still, with a coil of rope over his arm and no expression at all upon his long closed face. And it was at Krell that the Duke looked longest. "You came alone," said Lady Sibylla. It was not quite a question. How romantic, and how convenient. "You sent for me," said the Duke. His voice filled the ruin without seeming to rise. "I am safe enough," said the widow, "for the present. Whether she remains so depends, your grace, entirely upon how reasonable you prove. We are all reasonable people, I hope. There is a paper for you to sign, a small settlement, generous to your cousin, who has been so shamefully kept from his expectations by your tiresome good health, and then certain arrangements as to the future, and the girl walks free, and we all go home." She smiled. "You have only to be sensible. It is not, I think, in your nature, but you might try, for her sake. It was a lie, and he knew it, and she knew that he knew it, and behind her cold composure he could see the truth of the night laid out, that no paper he signed would save either of them, that they meant him and the maid both to be dead by morning, and the paper, whatever it said, to be found beside his body as proof of a lunatic's guilt. He had come to hear exactly this. He had come to make them say it, out loud in the open, with the reeds full of witnesses. So he spread his empty hands, and took a slow step forward into the lantern light, and gave them the rope to hang themselves. "Before I sign anything," he said, "I would hear the whole of it from your own mouths, that I may know what I am buying. It was monctured in my glass at the midsummer dinner, a conite of the wolfsbane, drawn strong. Which of you procured it?" "You, cousin, I think. The herb woman to the north remembers a fine gentleman with a white scar across his hand, who paid her a crown to teach him the making and another to hold her tongue. Do you deny it?" Lionel made a strangled sound. The pistol shook worse. How could you?" "He does not deny it," said Duke softly, and stepped again. "And you, madam, bound these two poor tools together, and steadied their nerve, and meant to wed my cousin over my grave and rule what you could not inherit. And you, Krell," he turned full upon the grey man in the shadows, and his voice at last let a little of the cold fury show through. "You poured it. Yours was the dark goods sleeve at the butler's pantry. Yours the hand that dosed the cordial jar the maid drank from, because you knew her small habits as you knew every soul's in my house, having watched us all these 11 years and hated us, I think, all the while. 11 years I fed you and housed you and trusted you with my keys, and you weighed my life against a heap of the hare's gold and found me the lighter. Say it. You are proud of the neatness of it. I have seen that pride in your face. Say it to me now." And Ambrose Krell, who had held his dry composure through it all, made the one mistake that pride makes, which is to answer contempt. His long face did not change, but his closing door voice came out of the shadow flat and cold and terrible in its calm. "I poured it," he said. "I should have used a surer poison, but I wished it to look like your heart, and it very nearly did. It would have, but for a scullery slut who could not mind her tray. 11 years I ran this house better than you deserved to have it run, while you played the great cold duke, and never once learned my Christian name. I do not repent it. I regret only that I bungled it twice. I shall not bungle it a third time, and neither the girl nor you, your grace, will see the sun come up." Lionel made a small broken sound at that, half a sob, and the pistol dipped in his hand. "You said," he whispered to the widow, "not to the Duke. You said it would be clean. You said no one need. You said it would look like his heart, and there would be no—" He turned his sweating face toward his cousin, and for a moment, through all the greed and the fear, there was something in it almost like a boy's. A boy who had followed cleverer and colder people down into a dark he had never truly understood until this moment, when he stood in a ruin at midnight with a pistol he did not want to fire and heard a murder spoken of as plainly as a bill of sale. "I never meant it to be like this, Errol. I only wanted the money, the debts, I only—" "Be silent," said Lady Sibylla without heat, without even turning her head, and the contempt in it was worse than any blow. "You wanted a dukedom you had not the wit to take. You want everything, cousin, and will pay for nothing, and now you want to weep and be forgiven at the very end, as you have wept and been forgiven your whole soft life. There is no forgiving here. Point the pistol and be a man for once, or give it to me." And Lionel flinched, and did not give it to her, and did not raise it either, but stood shaking between his cold conspirators and his cold cousin, and the Duke saw in that instant the whole rotten architecture of the thing entire, the weak greedy hare, the cold ambitious widow, the clever murderous steward. Each despising the others, each bound to the others by nothing but the noose they had woven together, and he pitied his cousin even then, a little for being the smallest and the softest fool in a company of monsters. That, said the Duke of Aberbroof, is all I required. He raised the lantern high, the signal, and from the black reeds behind him and the broken walls above and the shadowed arch, the night came alive. Sir Halloran the magistrate rose up from the reeds like judgment itself, with his officers about him. Harl and the keepers came silent and fast through the arch with cudgels and drawn hangers. Lanterns flared on every side, ringing the ruin in a closing circle of hard grim faces and honest law. So that the three plotters spun about and found every escape stopped, and the whole quiet weight of the county's justice standing witness to every word that had just been spoken in that place. Lionel dropped the pistol as if it had burned him and fell to his knees babbling. Lady Sibylla came off the beam with her cold face at last cracked open into naked fury, and then, seeing there was no bolt to run and no lie left to tell, into a white and silent understanding of the gallows. Krell alone kept his head and moved. Quick as the snake, he was, not toward escape, but toward the stair that led up to the little stone room above the wheel, the room where the maid was kept, meaning even now cornered and doomed, to make good his boast and have the girl's death at least, to fling her into the mill race before any hand could stop him. He got 3 steps up the stair. The Duke was already moving, but it was not the Duke who stopped him. For the wedged door at the head of that stair burst open from within, and Winifred Prowse came through it, free, her wrists raw and her hair down and her plain face fierce as an avenging saint, and she did not shrink from the grey man coming up at her with murder in his flat dead eyes. She had, in the long dark hours, made herself ready for exactly this. She had the one weapon the little stone room afforded, which was a broken length of the old oak door bar, heavy as a smith's arm. And she swung it two-handed with all the strength of a girl who had carried coal scuttles and water pails up 4 flights since she was 12, and she took Ambrose Krell across the shoulder and the side of the head as he lunged. And the neat, clever murderer of the house of Aberbroof pitched sideways off the narrow stair and fell, all his composure at last entirely lost, in an ungainly heap of grey limbs onto the grinding floor at the magistrate's very feet, where Harl and 2 officers were upon him before he could rise. The rope he had brought to bind a helpless maid was used within the minute to bind him, and so the trap closed, and the 3 who had reached so cleverly and so cruelly for a great man's death were taken, all together, in the open, with a magistrate and a dozen honest men to witness the confession from their own mouths. And there was no lawyer in England clever enough to unpick a rope so witnessed as that. But the Duke of Aberbroof, in that first wild moment, saw none of it. He saw only her. He was up the stair before Krell had well stopped rolling, and he caught Winifred as her legs went at last from under her, the strength that had swung the bar draining out of her all at once. Now the thing was done, and he gathered her in against him there on the narrow steps, in front of the magistrate and the officers and his kneeling, weeping cousin, and the whole assembled proof of his triumph, and he did not care one straw who saw. She was shaking. Her wrists were raw and bleeding. Her face was pressed into his coat, and he could feel that she was weeping now, silently. The way she wept, the fright of the long day finally spending itself, and he held her and put his hand against her loose hair and bent his head down over her and said her name, only her name again and again, as though it were the one word in the language that mattered. "I told you," he said when he could speak, low and rough for her alone. "I told you they would never touch you again. You came," she said, "into his coat. You great stubborn fool, you came alone, into all of it." "I came with the reeds full of men," he said, "and I came for you. And I would come again through worse, and I have done with pretending otherwise before the magistrate or the county or the king himself." He drew back just enough to see her face, her plain dear tear-streaked upturned face in the swinging lantern light. "You saved my life at that table with a whisper, Winifred Prowse, and you have just saved it again with an oak bar, and saved your own into the bargain, being, I begin to think, a good deal better at rescue than any duke that ever lived. There is only one thing I mean to do about it, and I mean to do it properly, and in the daylight, and not on a mill stair with a murderer at our feet. But I will not wait another hour to tell you the whole of it is true, and was always going to be true from the moment your hand closed over my glass. Below them they were leading the prisoners out into the night, Lionel stumbling and sobbing, Lady Sibylla white and silent and unbowed even now, and Crerid grey and groaning between two officers, the neat clever pride of him broken at last on the flagstones by a scullery maid's arm. The old magistrate looked up the stair at the Duke with the girl held close against him, and something almost like a smile moved in his hard old face, and he touched his hat and said, "Your Grace, we have them, and we have it all, and it is a clean and finished thing. Bring the young woman down when she is able. There is no more danger here tonight. No more danger." The Duke of Aberborough stood on the mill stair with the words settling over him like the first true quiet after a long war, and with the woman who had walked into all his dark country and pulled him out of it held safe at last within the circle of his arm, and he thought that he had never in his life heard 4 finer words, nor ever expected to owe them, of all the souls on earth. To the whisper of a poor maid who would not carry a poisoned tray up to his table and hold her tongue. The assizes came in the autumn, and the county talked of nothing else for a 12-month after. It was a clean case and a witnessed one, and the law, once it had all 3 of them in its patient hands, did not hurry and did not stumble. Ambrose Krell, who had poured death into his master's glass and gone up a mill stair to drown a bound girl, was convicted of attempted murder upon 2 counts and transported for the remainder of his natural life to a hard shore on the far side of the world, there to labour out his cleverness in a place that cared nothing for the neatness of a mind. And the grey composure he had worn so proudly for 11 years was never seen upon him again. Lady Sibylla Cray, whose cold ambition had bound the plot together, found that the great world she had schemed to rule closed its doors against her all at once and forever. Stripped of her connections and her welcome, her name a byword and her fortune eaten by the law, she retired at last to a mean lodging in a foreign town where no one knew her, and grew old there alone with her bright eyes gone dull, which, was those who knew the story said, a nearer thing to justice than the gallows would have been. And Lionel Vane, poor weak greedy Lionel, who had bought the knowledge of the poison with a crown and his soul, broke entirely in the dock and wept and confessed everything, and threw himself upon his cousin's mercy. The Duke gave him a strange mercy in the end, and a hard one. He did not let him hang. The man was his blood, and had been more fool than fiend, and Errol found he had no taste for a cousin's death upon his conscience however richly earned, but he stripped him of the heirship past all recovery, cut him wholly out of the entail by every lawful means his lawyers could contrive, and settled upon him a small bare income in a small bare cottage in the furthest corner of a distant county, on the single condition that he never again come within 40 miles of Aberborough or of its Duke, or of the woman its Duke meant to make his Duchess. And there Lionel lived out his days, neither hanged nor forgiven. A small diminished man who had reached for everything and been left with a cottage and a crust, and the long memory of how near he had come, which was, Errol thought, humbling enough, and more than the cold neat Duke of a year ago would ever have troubled to grant him. So the dark country was crossed, and the enemy scattered, and the house of Aberborough came out at last into the light. And through all the long business of the law, Winfred Prowse was no longer below stairs. He had brought her up out of the servants' hall the very morning after the mill, and he had done it in the face of the whole county, and he had not cared. He gave her into the care of a respectable widowed cousin of his own, a kind sharp old lady named Mrs. Fenwick, who had been the one person in his family never once to bore or disappoint him, and who took one look at Winfred's steady gold-flecked eyes and her raw brave wrists, and declared herself entirely at the Duke's service in the matter. And there, in Mrs. Fenwick's snug dower house, Winfred was clothed and fed and let, for the first time in her life, simply to rest, to sleep behind a door that no longer needed bolting, to eat from a plate no hand had poisoned, to walk in a garden with nothing to fear, and to be courted, slowly and properly and in the daylight, by the Duke of Aberborough, who called upon her every single day, and did not seem to know how to stop, for he did court her. He had promised her he would do the thing properly, and he was a man who kept his promises. He did not presume upon what he had done for her nor upon what she had done for him. He did not come as a great man conferring a great favor upon a kitchen girl. He came hat in hand, as a man who knew his own heart at last and was half afraid of it. And he sat with her in Mrs. Fenwick's parlour and talked with her the way he had talked with her in his study, as an equal, as the one person alive who told him the truth and made him laugh and was not afraid of him, and he watched the fright and the disbelief go slowly out of her, week by week. And something settled and shining come into its place. You must be sure, she told him once, in the garden, in the low gold of an autumn afternoon. You must be very sure, Errol, for he had long since made her use his name in private, and the using of it still cost her a little catch of breath each time, because it is you who will pay for this, more than me, and pay it all your life. They will never quite forgive you, the great houses. They will smile at your face and say behind their fans that the Duke of Aberbrowell married his scullery maid, and it will follow you into every drawing-room in England. I can bear it, for I have never had their good opinion to lose. But you had it. And you are giving it up for me, and I will not have you do it in a fit of gratitude and wake one morning and grieve for it. Listen to me, he said, took both her healed hands in his. I had their good opinion for near 40 years, and do you know what it bought me? A cold house and a cold bed and a cold heart, and a table full of smiling faces of which not one, in the whole of my life, ever loved me enough to knock a poisoned glass from my hand. You did that. A stranger, a maid I had never troubled to see. You reached out of the shadow I had put you in, and you saved my life, at the cost of your own bread, expecting nothing, and then you did it again with an oak bar, and I have discovered that beside the fact of you, Winefred, the good opinion of every drawing-room in England weighs precisely nothing. Less than nothing, a feather against the world. He lifted her hands and pressed his lips to the healed white marks the mopes had left upon her wrists, first one and then the other, slowly, as a man makes a vow. I am not grateful, or I am, but that is the least part of it and the smallest. I am in love with you, past all sense and all society and all saving. I have been since a night in the still room when a plain, brave girl told me she was not sorry she had done it, whatever came, marry me, not to pay a debt. Because I cannot any longer imagine the mornings without you, and I do not mean to try. And Winifred Prowse, who had buried her father and been turned into the road and scrubbed pots in the cold and swung an oak bar at a murderer and been, through all of it, afraid of nothing so much as of this. Of being loved, of daring to keep a thing so far above her station, looked up into the fierce, tender face of the man she had saved, and let go, at last, of the last hard, careful hold she had kept upon her heart, and said yes. They were married in the spring, in the old church at the edge of the park, with the May in blossom and the whole of the tenantry crowded grinning into the pews, and not one sneering drawing-room face among them, for the Duke had made very sure of the guest list. Her brother Tom came from Marbury in his new good coat, given a place in the estate's own wheelwright shop by a Duke who forgot nothing, and Mrs. Fenwick wept into her handkerchief, and Harl the gamekeeper stood at the back with his hat crushed in his fists and his weathered face working. And Mrs. Tarrow the housekeeper, who a year before had not known whether to curtsy to the girl or box her ears, curtsied now, low and glad, and meant it. Winefred came up the aisle in a gown of soft dove grey. She had chosen grey, she told him, laughing, because she had been a grey little shadow in his house so long that she meant to be the finest grey thing in England now, and put the shadow to shame, and the Duke of Aberbrowell, waiting for her at the altar rail, watched her come and thought that he had never in his life seen anything so beautiful, and knew, with the plain sure knowledge of a man who has crossed a dark country and come home, that he never would again. There was one guest at that wedding whom no one had expected, and whom the Duke had sought out himself. He had ridden, some weeks before, to a poor village to the north, to a half-blind old herb woman who kept a sort of simples for the toothache and the warts, and who had once, for the price of a crown and a stranger's fear, held a secret that helped hang a house of murderers, and he had brought her home in his own carriage, given her a snug cottage on the edge of his land and a pension for the remainder of her days. For she had told the truth when the telling was dangerous, and the Duke of Aberbrowell had learned, at last and forever, what such courage was worth. She sat in the front pew in a new black gown, weeping into a handkerchief she could barely see. And when Winfred passed her going up the aisle, the old woman reached out and touched the dove-grey sleeve, once as one might touch a thing for luck, and the new duchess stopped and bent and kissed the withered cheek before the whole church, which were thing no duchess in the county's memory had ever done, and which the county talked of, in the end, more warmly than any scandal. The years were good to them, and long and full. She made the cold house warm. She knew every soul beneath its roof by name and by trouble, having been one of them, and there was never again a servant at Aberborough who went unseen or unthanked, nor a poisoned heart festering unmarked in its passages, for the duchess had scrubbed those passages once herself, and missed nothing that happened in them. She bore him children in the fullness of time, and he was, to the endless astonishment of the county, a doting and unguarded father, the iron gone entirely out of him and something better grown in its place, and to the end of a long life together, on the worst days and the best. The Duke of Aberborough would take his wife's hand and turn it over and press his lips to the faint white marks the ropes had left, that never wholly faded, and say, sometimes aloud and sometimes only with his eyes, the thing that had become between them a private grace said over every parting and every meeting and every quiet evening by the fire. "Don't drink that, your grace," she would answer him, before he could speak it, her gold-flecked eyes bright with the old mischief and the old love. That was the whole of it, Errol. 4 words and a hand on a glass. 4 words, he would agree, and a hand on a glass. The best luck of my life, and I very nearly told you to take it off. And he would draw her in against him. This woman who had reached out of the shadow and pulled him into the light and never once let go, and hold her treasured and safe and wholly loved, for as long as there was breath in him to do it, which was in the end a very long time indeed.